The first thing that we need to talk about is something called simple intervals. And there's something else we're going to talk about later called compound intervals. But first, simple intervals are any intervals that are less than an octave. And just in case you didn't understand this yet, an interval is simply the distance between two different notes in music. And it's really, really important to be able to measure the distance between notes in music so that we can understand how chords work and we can understand how the melodies that we come up with and play in songs that we learn work as well. So we're going to be checking out the different kinds of simple intervals. And to do this, we're going to start out with the major scale. Okay. One of the most important places to start is just understanding the intervals that we get from the major scale. So those of you know, the C major scale is spelled out right here on the iPad here on the left, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And some of you may have been familiar with this idea of playing these notes and giving them each a number. So C is 1, D is 2, E is 3, F is 4, G is 5, A is 6, B is 7, and then C is 1 again. So let's go ahead and write these notes out here on the fretboard. Now we can play these notes any way that we want to, but let's go ahead and use this simple small scale pattern. A lot of times I like to do things on one string at a time too, but all the concepts we're going to talk about in this video are applicable to anywhere on the fretboard. It doesn't matter what the fingering is. It's more the concept that you want to get in your head, and then you apply it yourself to the guitar neck. So the first technical interval that we can have is what's called a unison. So if there's like two different notes being played in a row, and let's say it's a C and then a C again. Well, we would just say the intervals between those two notes are unison because it's the same note being played over and over. Pretty easy to remember. So then the next type of interval we need to know is a second. So the distance between C to D is going to be a second. Why? Because C is 1 and then D is 2. So we just call that a second. And in particular, in the major scale, the kind of second that we find is called a major second. That is a major second. Whenever you have a note that just moves up 2 frets on the fingerboard, we would call that a major second. Now, if you notice on the interval list that we have there, I actually wrote down 2 kinds of intervals next to each of the main types. So you have seconds, but then next to that I've listed major and minor. So for each of these, there's the major interval for seconds, but there's also what we would call a minor second. So for example, if we move that D down to D flat, that would be a minor second. So if we take any of these major intervals and make it 1/2 step lower, that turns it into a minor interval. And sometimes the naming is going to get a little bit tricky. We'll go over that in a second, but obviously we don't have to worry about that minor second for right now because, well, there's no minor second in the major scale. So let's go through the next interval. So if we moved from C to E, so we just played C and then E, we would call that a third. Why? Because we're starting on that note and then we're moving up 1, 2, 3 from C, D to E. Okay, so that's a third. And in this case, we also call that a major third. Okay, so if we move that down to E flat, which again, that's also not in the key, that would actually be a minor third. There's going to be other minor thirds that are going to pop up in a bit though, just not when we start them from C. So that's our third. And then we have fourths. So if we go from C to F, that would be a fourth. C to F. And then if we went from C to G, that would be a fifth. C, G. And for fourths and fifths, we call those perfect intervals. We don't call those major. There's no such thing as a major fourth. There's perfect fourth and then perfect fifth. So you can also have augmented fourth and augmented fifth. So an augmented fourth is if we take that F and move it up to F sharp, that would be what we call an augmented fourth. And you see that's a kind of dissonant sounding interval. Now there is an augmented fourth found in the major scale, just not between C and another note. We're going to cover that in just a second. And also technically, by the way, you could have a diminished fourth and a diminished fifth. So a diminished would be if I took it and lowered it by a half step. But if you see here, look, it's funny. I have that E written there. Look, I can't even move it down because a diminished fourth is basically the same thing as a major third. So we just kind of forget about that one. Okay, so we'll actually just literally go ahead and cross out the diminished fourth because no one ever uses that. It's kind of ridiculous if you ever wrote a diminished fourth. But with perfect fifths, you can do the same thing. So you can make a diminished fifth by lowering G to G flat. And actually, a diminished fifth is the same thing as an augmented fourth, okay? And then you also can move G up to G sharp, or in this case, you could write as A flat as well. We'll talk about that in a second. Technically, an A flat would not be an augmented fifth, but the pitch is the same. I would just rename this G sharp, and now it's an augmented fifth. So again, with the fifths and fourths, they're perfect. And if you raise them a half step, they become augmented. And if you lower them a half step, they become diminished. And with fourths, we don't even use diminished fourth because it's the same thing as a major third, actually. So now if we play from C to A, that's our major sixth. So C, and now I'm playing A here. You got to skip a string. In this case, using this scale pattern that we're using, C to A, that's a major sixth. And sort of like what I talked about with sixths, you have two kinds. You have major and minor. So if I lowered that A to A flat, that would be a minor sixth interval. So you got your major sixth, your minor sixth, and then finally we have our seventh. So if we play from C all the way to B, then we will have our major seventh interval. You notice that the major one is kind of called major because it's also what happens when you construct it from the major scale, from the first note of the major scale to the seventh note of the major scale is a major seventh, right? We kind of have just seen them all be major, and we've had to, if we wanted to make it the minor version, we had to kind of break out of the key. So if we had C to B, there's our major seventh, and then C to B flat, again, that's not in the key, but C to B flat, that would be a minor seventh interval, okay? So with that being said, remember that. So you got major seconds and minor seconds, you got major thirds, minor thirds, you got perfect fourths, perfect fifths, and then you also have the augmented and diminished fourths and fifths. And then for sixths and sevenths, you're back to just having a major and minor. Major sixth, minor sixth, and then major seventh, minor seventh. And the best way to remember them, again, is remembering them based on the actual major scale and knowing, okay, well, if I go from the first note in the major scale to the third note, that's a major third. If I go from the first note to the sixth note, that's a major sixth. And if I modify that, that's how I can get my minor sixths or my minor thirds. Now, we're going to figure out, wait a second, how do we actually get some of these other intervals I mentioned that earlier, minor thirds, minor sixths, in the major scale? Well, it's a little complicated, but I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible for you. So first of all, let's say that we were going to now play not starting from the C note, but let's say we're going to start from the E note. And let's say now, first of all, if we're starting an interval from E, Now we kind of have to think of E as the 1, okay? E is our starting note that we're starting from. So what if I wanted to go up a sixth from E? Well, I could start from E and then just kind of keep counting up. So E would be 1, and then F would be 2, and then G would be 3, A would be 4, B would be 5, and C would actually be sixth, starting from E. So E to C, we know that's some kind of sixth, right? But how do we know what kind of sixth it is? And this is how we know. So we have to actually ideally be familiar with the E major scale, right? Because if you look now, the notes in the E major scale are written right here. They're E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, and D sharp. Okay, so if you notice, the sixth in the key of E is a C sharp. So that means that would be a major sixth. So E to C sharp is a major sixth. So in order to have C natural, it's like if we took C sharp and we basically just got rid of the sharp there. And that would turn it into a minor sixth, or we could also call that a flat sixth. Does that make sense? So let's go back here 1 second. So now we figured out that E to C is a sixth interval, but it's not just any sixth interval. It is actually a minor sixth interval. So that's where you're going to start to get some of these other intervals when we see, oh, well, what if we start on A and go to C? Or what if we start on D and go to B? Or what if we start on E and go to G? Now you're going to start getting some of those minor intervals that didn't exist when we started from the C note. I hope that this is making sense so far. Let's try actually one more example of that. Let's say we wanted to find a third up from E. Okay, so E, we would say, okay, remember we're starting on E as our starting point. That's our sort of new 1. So we just count E, F, G. 1, 2, 3. So E to G is some kind of third. But now, is it a major third or is it a minor third? Well, we have to reference back to the E major scale. So guess what? The third in E major scale is G sharp. So that means that since this ain't G sharp, this is G natural. That means it's a half step lower than G sharp. Therefore, it's not a major third interval, it is a minor third. Okay, so does that make sense? That's how we see, like, also another example of this would be, now I'm just gonna kind of go really quickly here, D to F. That would be a minor third. Why? Because a major third from D would be F sharp. So D to F is a minor third. So this is something that you don't have to like memorize every single possible combination of this right now, but it's just important for you to start being in the right mindset for when you approach intervals and also chords in the future, okay? So we're going to cover one more thing, and then we're going to cover actually how to practice this stuff in a musical way that's actually going to be fun for you, right? Because, you know, we can sit here and explain all this stuff till I'm blue in the face, but it's way better if we can actually practice it in a musical way. You'll actually be able to, you know, make something cool with it, right? So the last thing we're going to talk about is something called compound intervals. So compound intervals are actually really easy once you know the simple intervals. Compound intervals are basically just intervals greater than 1 octave. So for every one of the simple intervals, there's a sort of compound interval equivalent. So for example, if we had our C major scale and we count, you know, C is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then instead of just circling back to 1, we think of this C up an octave. We think of it as an eighth. And by the way, I didn't mention that before. An octave is just the same note, but a higher version, right? So we can keep counting from there and keep building the scale basically in another octave. So we could have C, D. Instead of that being the second, we'd call that the ninth because C is 8, now D is 9, and then E would be 10, F would be 11, G would be 12, A would be 13, B would be 14, and then C would, again, up an octave, technically be 15. So there's technically a way to play compound intervals where it's even more than one octave. Like, well, what if we played from C down here all the way to E up here or something, right? So yeah, that's something that you could, count it and say, oh, this is, I don't even know what number, but nobody does that. So basically when it comes to just thinking about it in your head, the most that we're ever going to count to is actually really 13. No one ever really thinks of 14s and 15s. That's getting a little bit outside of the scope of this video, but the more important ones to remember when it comes to like learning chords and stuff is actually the 9th, the 11th, and the 13th. But so you should definitely remember the compound interval equivalent of each of these intervals. So for example, if I was going to play a major ninth, if I played from C to D up this octave here, first of all, that's a great sounding interval. But that we would call it a major ninth. Or C up to this E here on the second string, that's a major 10th. The C up to this F up an octave here, that's a perfect 11th. C to G is a perfect 12. And then C to that A up an octave there is a 13th. Major 13th, major 14th. So you have to memorize like seconds and ninths are basically the same thing, just up an octave. Thirds and tenths are the same thing, just up an octave. Fourths and 11ths are the same thing, fifths and 12ths. 6ths and 13ths, and 7ths and 14ths. And as you can see right here underneath the C major scale, you can see the simple interval labels on top, and then underneath you can see the compound interval version. So just a quick primer on compound intervals. Okay, so as we wrap this up, what should you actually do about this, right? Okay, yeah, I just blabbed about intervals for a while, but what are some action steps that you can take? So first, what I would do is practice playing interval patterns in the major scale. So what do I mean by this? So let's say I want to play the scale in thirds, okay? So a third, let's go back up here, a third from C is E, right? So I go, okay, cool. A third from C is E. But then let's now, instead of starting from C, let's start from D. So I go, okay, D, what's a third up from that? Oh, it's F. So C, E, D, F, and then keep rinsing, repeating that process. E, go up a third to G, F, go up a third to A, G, go up a third to B, A, go up a third to C, B, go up a third to D, and then C, go up a third to E. So practice playing them going upwards and then also downwards. Like what if we go from E and then go down a third to C, right? So just basically doing it in reverse. E, C, F, D, G, E, A, F, B, G, C, A, D, B, E, C. So rather than just me showing it to you like that, let's actually hear what it would sound like. And we're gonna actually play a backing track that has a C note in the bass. So there, that was that backwards third pattern I showed you. Let's do it upwards. Cool. So now you should basically do that with all of the intervals. So doing that, try playing the scale in seconds. Everybody knows how to play the scale in seconds. When you play it in seconds. then you're just basically, playing it up and down, right? That's moving stepwise. But playing the scale in fourths, so from C to F, and then D to G, and then E to A, and so on and so forth. Fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh. Okay, so let's try practicing the scale in fifths. So this one's really cool. So we're gonna start with C to G. C, G, and then D to A, D, A, and then E to B, E, B, and then F to C, and then G to D, and I'm just gonna keep going. And then same thing, doing that one in reverse, like. And then of course, these are amazing like technical exercises too, so that you can, get faster. You try to do it with a different subdivision other than what I was just using there as quarter notes. So like. So go through yourself and work out some different interval patterns and just practice playing them up and down like that, and ideally play it over some kind of backing track. Then practice naming intervals in your head. So in any scale, any key, you should be able to ask a question and be able to answer it. So I should be able to ask you, okay, what is the sixth in the key of C? And you should be able to go, oh, it's A. Or you should be able to say from C to A. Or I should be able to ask you, well, what is a third above D in the key of C? Okay, D, it's to F. So there's a lot of different ways to sort of quiz yourself on that, but you should be able to name the notes in each key that you know, and then be able to name the intervals all in your head, not using the guitar, okay? If you use the guitar as a crutch, it's just gonna make you slower, You gotta be fast with these things for them to actually be like useful when you're playing. So, number 3 is actually using some of these interval patterns that we talked about before to play a solo, right? So I will try now. I'm going to not play them all in order. I'm just going to think, okay, well, let me play a solo, and I'm going to use some of those thirds. Let's go back to the third pattern, and let's see what that happens there. So like... And of course, when you're, improvising for real, you don't have to think, oh, gee, I better only play thirds and really follow the rules. No, it's more of like, okay, I have the interval pattern in my head, but let me go ahead and, just use that as a basis for my improv, but then I'll let myself break out of that a little bit. So number 4, don't forget about backwards intervals. So you can actually, for every single interval upwards, you can think of it backwards as well. So for example, if C going up to G is a perfect fifth, then from G going down to C is also a perfect fifth, right? So if from E up to C is a sixth, well then C down to E is also a sixth. All of those intervals, you got to be able to think of them backwards too. And that's why I was talking about before. Make sure that when you actually play through these things, make sure you play them forwards and backwards for sure. And then the last action step I'll leave you with is when you learn parts from songs that you like, try to see if you can recognize some of the intervals that are going on. Like, for example, in the song Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd, there's this really cool solo, and there's this part where he solos with fourths. So that little run there, I go, oh wait, that sounds like that. Because he's playing fourths there. It happens to be fourth. D and G, and then E and A. And actually, you see them there on the screen. D and G, that's a fourth. And then E and A, that's a fourth. So fourths can have a certain shape to them. They, a lot of times, are in the same fret or almost the same fret. Frets right next to each other. It depends on what strings that you're playing them on. So if you want to learn how to master the guitar fretboard so you can play in any key anywhere on the guitar fretboard and be able to work out these different intervallic patterns and use them in your soloing and your playing, then make sure you head on over to Jamsville.com right now and check out the Jamsville GPS Fretboard Fundamentals course. Also, make sure you check out the Jamsville merch store so you can get a really cool Jamsville t-shirt or hat just like these that I have on right now. And make sure you check out my favorite guitar picks, the Precision pick from Dan's Guitar Store. These are my favorite picks that I've ever used because the grip on them is unbelievably strong and it has this really awesome beveled edge and pointy tip that cuts through the strings like a knife through butter. Make sure you hit like and subscribe to the channel, and until next time, listen, learn, and jam.